When I was 20, I returned to college after a long break. My friends and I were thrilled to be back together, and we wasted no time catching up. One night, we decided to play a late game of volleyball on the campus field. The night was cool, the air filled with laughter and friendly banter as we spiked the ball back and forth under the dim lights. Time slipped by without us noticing, and when I finally checked the time, it was already 2 a.m. "All right, guys," I said, tossing the ball into my bag. "We should call it a night." Reluctantly, we packed up, grabbed our things, and piled into my car to head home. The roads were quiet, the streetlights casting an eerie glow across the empty lanes. A strange stillness had settled over the night, as if the world was holding its breath. As we turned onto a winding road leading out of campus, something caught my eye on the side of the road. A figure. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was a child, standing all alone in the shadows. He looked no older than 7 or 8, dressed in a plain shirt and shorts. His face was pale, and he seemed to be crying silently, his shoulders trembling as he looked down at the ground. I slowed the car, glancing at my friends in the back seat. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah!" one of them muttered, peering out the window. "A kid, what's he doing out here?" I felt a strange, unexplainable pull to stop to help him. "Should we see if he's all right?" I said, moving my foot to the brake. But my friend in the passenger seat, David, quickly shook his head. "No, man, don't stop," he said, his voice tense. "This doesn't feel right." I hesitated, torn between my instinct to help and the unsettling vibe that had washed over us. The kid didn't move, just continued to stand there, his shoulders still shaking as if he were quietly sobbing. "Let's just keep going," David urged again, a little louder this time. Reluctantly, I took my foot off the brake and pressed on the gas. We passed by the child, his figure fading into the darkness in the rearview mirror. But as we continued down the road, I couldn't shake the unease that was crawling up my spine. The air inside the car felt heavy, the silence among us thick with tension. Just as I was starting to think we'd made the right decision, something happened. Out of nowhere, I felt the wheel jerk in my hands, and before I could react, we were careening off the road. I barely had time to register what was happening before we crashed into a tree. The impact was brutal, a loud crunch of metal and glass shattering around us. Everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was disoriented, my vision blurry and my head pounding. The car was a mess, the front end crumpled against the tree. I turned to see my friends slowly coming to me, each of them groaning and checking themselves for injuries. Thankfully, we were all alive but shaken to the core. As I stumbled out of the car, trying to catch my breath, my mind flashed back to the kid we'd seen on the road. The pale face, the silent tears. Had he somehow been connected to this? I glanced back down the road, half expecting to see him standing there, but there was nothing. Just an empty stretch of pavement disappearing into the dark. Did we crash because of him? One of my friends mumbled, his voice shaky. I didn't answer. I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that the image of that child, standing alone in the middle of the night, would haunt me. It felt as if something or someone had wanted us to see him, had drawn us in with that sorrowful face and pale, haunting expression. The crash had shaken us, but something about that child left an even deeper mark, a lingering unease that settled over me every time I drove alone at night. In the days that followed, I kept replaying the scene, unable to shake the feeling that we'd encountered something beyond explanation that night. I had been taught to believe in what I could see and touch, but after that night, I knew some things simply defy reason. It was a rainy Friday evening when I decided to treat myself to a pizza after a long week at work. The clouds were thick and heavy, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I curled up on the couch, ready for a cozy night in with a cheesy pepperoni pizza and a good horror movie. The flickering of the television screen added to the ominous atmosphere, making me feel both excited and slightly anxious. As I waited for my order, the storm intensified, lightning illuminating the room for brief moments, followed by the loud crack of thunder that shook the house. I loved storms, but tonight something felt off. I brushed off the unease and focused on the movie playing on the screen, allowing myself to become engrossed in the chilling plot. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang, cutting through the tension of the film. I jumped up, excitement bubbling in my stomach. I opened the door to find a young delivery driver, his hair drenched and clothes clinging to him from the relentless rain. "Your pizza," he said, handing over the box with a weary smile. Drive safe out there." "Thanks, I will," I replied, closing the door behind him. Little did I know, that warning would haunt me for the rest of the night. I set the pizza on the counter and took a moment to admire its cheesy goodness before digging in. Just as I was about to take my first bite, I heard a loud crash outside, followed by the sound of tires screeching against the wet pavement. My heart raced as I ran to the window, peering out into the dark, rain-soaked street. In the distance, I saw a car veering off the road, colliding with a tree. My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and rushed outside, the rain drenching me instantly. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of gasoline filled my nostrils as I approached the wreck. The car was a twisted metal mess, steam rising from the engine. I could see a man slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. Panic surged through me. "Are you okay?" I shouted, hoping for a response. But there was only silence. I hesitated, my instincts battling with fear. Should I help him or call for help? Just then I noticed a figure standing in the shadows nearby, a woman, her eyes wide with fear. "Help! He's my husband!" she cried, rushing toward me. "Stay back!" I shouted, stepping toward the wrecked vehicle. But something about her urgency felt wrong. "I'll call for help!" As I fumbled with my phone, the woman's expression shifted from desperation to something darker. "You shouldn't have come out here," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I turned to run, but stumbled in the mud and fell hard against the asphalt. I could hear the woman's footsteps approaching, and dread gripped me. "Help, someone!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. I turned to run back toward my apartment, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear her laughter behind me, a cold, mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. Just as I reached my door, I glanced back and saw the man had somehow gotten out of the car, his face twisted in fury. I burst through the door, locking it behind me. My heart pounded as I heard the sound of pounding fists on the other side. "Let me in!" the man shouted, his voice low and menacing. I stumbled backward, fear flooding my senses. Moments later, the police sirens grew louder, and I felt a flicker of hope. I peered out the window and saw flashing lights approaching. The pounding on the door stopped, and I held my breath, hoping the officers would arrive in time. Just as the door burst open, officers rushed in, guns drawn. "Get back!" they shouted, surrounding the man and woman. The scene unfolded in a flurry of chaos, the officers handcuffing the pair and leading them away. "Are you okay?" one officer asked me, concern etched on his face. I nodded, still shaking. "I think so. I didn't know what was happening." The officer nodded, glancing back at the couple being escorted outside. "They're a known criminal duo. We've been tracking them for a while. You did the right thing by calling us." As the officers took the suspects away, I finally felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a mix of relief and disbelief. I sank onto my couch, still drenched from the rain, and tried to process everything that had just happened. The storm continued to rage outside, but my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of the man's furious expression or the woman's sinister smile. They had seemed so normal at first, just desperate people needing help. But now I understood the danger that lurked beneath their facade. After the officers finished their investigation and assured me I was safe, they left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I glanced at the pizza box sitting on the kitchen counter. Its promise of comfort was now a reminder of the night's events. I had wanted a relaxing evening, a simple treat to unwind, but instead, I had faced a nightmare. As I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the sounds of the storm outside began to fade. I reached for my phone to check the time, and as I did, I noticed a message from the delivery service. "We hope you enjoyed your pizza. Thank you for your order." I couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. It was surreal. How could they not know what had just transpired? I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was safe now. The horrors of that night would linger in my mind, a haunting reminder that sometimes the dangers we face are not always what they seem. I resolved then to never let my guard down again, even in the safety of my own home. I was at my friend's house in the forest that night, celebrating his wedding. It was supposed to be a quick drop-by, but celebrations ran late, and he and his family kept asking me to stay overnight. The rain was relentless outside, and the fog was thickening by the minute, making me second-guess my decision to drive home. But I had an important meeting early the next morning, one I couldn't afford to miss. Finally, I said my goodbyes, promising to catch up again soon, and headed to my car. The air was thick, the sky dark, and the rain unyielding, coming down in sheets. Visibility was poor, with only the narrow beam of my headlights illuminating the slippery road ahead. I'd barely reached the main road when the weather took a turn for the worse. The rain felt like it was suffocating the headlights, reducing the visibility to mere feet in front of me. The road twisted through the forest, sharp turns barely visible until I was upon them. I gripped the wheel tightly, knowing one wrong move could send me straight into the dense trees. I kept glancing at the clock, silently cursing myself for leaving so late. My friend's voice echoed in my head, urging me to stay, but I shook it off. Just a few more miles, I thought. Then, out of nowhere, bright headlights pierced through the rain, blinding me. They were on the wrong side of the road, coming toward me at high speed. I honked, flicked my headlights, and tried everything to get the other driver's attention, but it was too late. The next few seconds were a blur as I tried to swerve, the screech of tires slicing through the storm, and then impact. The force of the collision was like hitting a wall. The seatbelt cut into my chest as my car spun, the world outside blurring into a dizzying mix of darkness and rain-streaked glass. The airbags deployed, cushioning me slightly, but I still felt a sharp, blinding pain shoot through my body. My vision faded in and out, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, the rain was still hammering down on the wreckage, the interior of my car dimly lit by the glow of the dashboard. My head was throbbing and my vision was hazy. I could make out the shape of another car, crumpled and smoking, a few feet away. Slowly, painfully, I unbuckled myself and tried to push open my door, but it wouldn't budge. I forced myself to focus on assessing my injuries. My leg was aching, and there was a metallic taste in my mouth, blood. Struggling, I turned to look at the other car. Its driver's side door was open, and a man was stumbling out, clearly disoriented. Even through the fog of pain and rain, I could see he was swaying, barely able to stand. The smell of alcohol hit me, carried over by the wind. My anger flared, even as my body was barely holding together. He'd been drinking. Just as I was about to shout, flashing red and blue lights appeared through the storm. Relief washed over me, and I slumped back in my seat, exhaustion taking over. The police car pulled up, and 2 officers quickly got out, one of them rushing over to check on me. I managed to give a weak nod, signaling that I was alive, albeit barely. The other officer approached the man from the other car, who was stumbling around, attempting to justify his actions with slurred words. "I didn't see the rain," he stammered, barely able to string his words together. The officer caught a whiff of his breath, and I saw the knowing look pass between the officers. They'd dealt with this before. As the officer questioned him, the man grew defensive, shouting and stumbling, his anger seeming to intensify his inebriation. Eventually, one of the officers had to restrain him, handcuffing him while he continued to mutter incoherent excuses. I watched the scene unfold, anger and despair twisting in my stomach. All of this was because he couldn't be bothered to stay off the road until he was sober. Paramedics arrived soon after, prying open my door and carefully helping me out of the car. I was loaded onto a stretcher, my mind still foggy but filled with a sense of relief that it was over. As they wheeled me to the ambulance, I caught one last look at the man. He was still being restrained by the officers, his head hanging low, his face a mix of regret and drunken defiance. As the ambulance pulled away, I felt a flood of emotions, relief, exhaustion, but also a lingering anger. This could have all been avoided if he'd made a different choice, a safer choice. Instead, both of us had almost paid a heavy price. The next morning, bruised and battered in a hospital bed, I thought back to that night. My friend's warnings, the storm, the moment of collision, it all played back in my mind like a bad dream. I had survived, and my injuries would heal, but the memory of that driver's careless actions would stay with me forever. A haunting reminder of how quickly life could turn from calm to chaos. And all because someone had chosen to drink and drive, putting lives at risk, turning a quiet night into a scene of horror.